There you go, sir.
So this afternoon we will have Dr. Michael Biehl from Germany, who will be presenting to us a paper on theological education in a secularized context. So I will not introduce him myself, but I will ask Michael to introduce himself and also share about his work and how he's connected to OCMS. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Marina, and also thank you to the OCMS Fellowship for inviting me. And first of all, am I well heard? And is it maybe possible that I see something else than the pillar and the bookshelves? Because, there you are. That's nicer. So at least I have the feeling that I'm talking to some people. Thank you very much. So first of all, am I well to be understood? Okay, loud enough? Good. There, at least from the tiles, I see somebody. Well, thank you for the information and for the honor to be part of your series. And as Marina introduced me, my name is Michael Biehl. I work for the Association of Protestant Churches and Missions in Germany, especially with the focuses on theological education worldwide and mission studies. And in this capacity, I'm happy to be part of your lecture series on theological education and missional formation. And EMW is partnering with OCMS in various aspects. It's on one hand support of some of the scholarship programs that you have for doctoral studies. It's also partnering in terms of publication of Regnum. And last but not least, it has been a cooperation in the context of the study process of the to mark the celebration of the founding of the International Missionary Council. And there I see my good friend Esther. Nice to see you. Hell. Yeah, what I was thinking about in the context of this series of lectures, which so far I followed as attentively as I could, is actually to reflect with you and in front of you about the challenges that a secularized context poses to theological education, and in that sense also poses questions to what we can understand under the heading of missional formation. And I'm going to present something and will share my screen now, so that at least some of the things that I'm going to tell you will hopefully be able to be read. So, okay. In the context of these series on missional formation and theological education, I wish to offer some reflections about missional formation in a secular context like in Germany. We all are aware that secular and secularism, secularizations are buzzwords, and I learned in long discussions that in different contexts, they may stand for different things. So I think, for instance, of the seminal book by Charles Taylor, who has been writing about this, I don't know, 500 pages around. And I would pick up from him, from his observations, that in a philosophical perspective, our times are defined as secular in the sense of being defined by an immanent framework. By this, as I understand Taylor, he means that meaning cannot be found on an external reference like God or the transcendence in general. It needs to be found within this world, and this naturally is a great challenge for theology and also a task for mission to address this understanding of secular and how can we proclaim and communicate the gospel in times which are defined by such a framework. For my lecture, I would emphasize 3 points to characterize, first of all, the conditions of the context that I'm speaking about as secular. The first one is the existence of a secular framework as a result of secularization processes, mainly the separating of political and religious institutions, thus limiting the influence of religious organizations in the country that I'm living in. However, As we will see, this gave in Germany way to a legally defined cooperation between political and religious institutions. And these are offering again privileges to the majority churches in the Protestant mainline and also the Roman Catholic Church in comparison to other religious communities. I will say a little bit more about that later. The second point is that with modernity, religion has not waned as many have assumed, and like people Max Weber, but its forms have multiplied and diversified. So today we have a large variety of Christian groups, other religions, new religious movements, and even esoteric groups with religious convictions in the same country side by side. And if I hope my English is understandable, I would formulate that these varieties of the absolute are interpreted by many in the German society as relativizing the truth. How can be something true what you find in such a diversity and multiplicity? And you may remember the famous book by Peter Berger, who has termed the imposed need to select among this diversity as the necessity of a heretical imperative. People need to choose. It is not so evident who is offering the truth, and they need some reference points to have criteria for selecting. The third point is that under these conditions, we see that the connection between the churches and their people or their members has loosened, and the perspective of these people on their churches has changed. There is an obvious decline in membership numbers, but this is only one aspect of this loosened connection, and the numbers do not explain everything, especially not on how people perceive and experience faith or how they position themselves to faith, tenets, and dogmatic and creed. In my context, sociologists observe that people inside and outside the church design their own household of religion and faith tenets rather freely. It is, according to them, not the proclamation of the church which defines what people should believe, but the people choose, as within a heretical imperative. What they define as their faith or belief is in turn the gestalt of faith from which they evaluate how close or how far away they feel to the church as the institution that is proclaiming a certain truth and a certain message. And I think that here we can observe, at least in my context, that the well-known formula of believing and belonging seems to feel apart. Many people don't want to belong to the church, but that doesn't mean that they do not believe somehow. As the sociologist Armin Nasehi explains, the authenticity and consistency of the own life has become the criteria of what people believe, not the set of values or beliefs which the church is offering. And this is what he says: it is less the living out of a given form of religious practices by the individual. No, the forms themselves have been individualized. It is evident that as well for the highly religious as for the religious interlocutors, the reference for the plausibility of the sentences which can be uttered, and that is meant in the context of religion, is the own life practice. What can that mean? I look at what he is saying, and he says that especially high religious people struggle with the demands of consistencies of the confessional tradition of their churches. And Nasehi observes that these individuals solve this conflict of consistency by embedding it into and relating it to an attempt of an authentic presentation of their lifestyle, and by striving for consistency in that life, not for consistency with church traditions. For them, the own life practice and being able to present it as authentic becomes the decisive point of reference and hence the solution of the conflict. This authentic presentation, according to Nasehi, is striving at creating a vision of one's own life as unified, as being not fragmented, against the challenges of experiences, social differentiation, inconsistency, and incomprehensible moments which tend to make life meaningless. And I think that position I want to strengthen very much, because I think it is what many people do even within the church, so that their own household of religion, of faith tenets, is becoming the point of reference for what they believe. And as I said, and I'm just repeating it to make the point clear, from there they would judge how far, how close, how closely connected they want to be with a church or a church community. And I remember a cartoon where the cartoonist is painting a man standing in his open door, and there is a small figure, a missionary recognizable by the Bible, that person is carrying under his arm, and that man in the door says, "Jesus, oh, that man is dead for me." And the pun in German is that in German, the words he uses are exactly the words which you would need to translate into English: "Jesus, that man has died for me." He uses what is offered to him as the gospel, "Jesus died for you, for your sins," to explain that this man is dead for him, doesn't have any importance, and that he has left this faith behind. The cartoon is explaining well that many are not opposed to Christian faith in my country. They feel they have outgrown it. It is something of their past that they are looking back to, but which they would not consider as something important for the present moment and the present state of their life. The secular, as I look into it in my context, is for many not the opposite of faith. It is the framework, as Nasehi explained, in which people seek and attempt to construct their own household of faith and make their life meaningful. And I'm interested more in understanding how this secularism and secularity form the ways of believing and belonging, and less in those who end up in an agnostic or even atheist position. I think one of the big challenges of mission in our context is actually to reach out to those people who have formed this own consistency of life, this own understanding of a household of faith, and to engage with what that tells them about the faith that the church is proclaiming. And I think sometimes that many people in my country look on those people who say God exists in the same mild, disturbed way, like on those who firmly contest that there is a God, the atheist. How can you be so sure of something which is ultimately uncertain, they may ask, and try to form that into their context. Academic theological education. The separation of altar and throne, or church and political power, was replaced in my country by contracts regulating the relation between the majority Protestant and Roman Catholic churches on the one hand, and on the state on the other hand. This relates to things like religious education in school, to ministry in prison and the military, but also to theological education, because you may be aware that one element of these contracts is in that the state is supporting faculties of theology at state universities. Sorry, I need to silence my phone. I forgot that. That's a bad thing. Okay. The professors of this theological faculties are paid by the state, and they are employees of the universities, not by the churches. This is a privilege which other churches do not have. For instance, the Baptist or the Methodists and others, which voted against such contracts. This is why we label them usually as free churches, a label which does not make any sense outside of Germany. But their decision to stay away from such contracts is the point which labels them as free from this kind of state engagement. And the function of the faculties at universities is not only to educate future theologians, pastors, educators for the religious education in our schools. Theologians of the mainline churches, Protestant and Catholics, interact at the university with secular disciplines. Quite a number of these theologians are, for instance, members of various ethical commissions on a government level, like those who study questions of medical treatment at the beginning or towards the end of life, which comes a lot of questions for the ethical attitude and attitude. Coping with secularism in my context includes, therefore, to link the theological discourses with neighboring secular discourses on the same matter. This interdisciplinary dialogue comes with the challenge to bring in a faith perspective into secular discourses, and on the other hand, to include secular methods and discourses into the theological reflection within the theological community to make it connectable. What are now the consequences of the named characteristics of secularism or secularity for a reflection on missional formation? The formation of mainline church theologians at state universities requires the theological education to meet standards for the quality of the education, which are independent from their belief in God. Standards and the methodologies to measure the success of this education are more concerned about the content and the number of pages students are reading and whether they have understood them or not, but it's not concerned about the firmness of faith. It's about academic standards that they share with other disciplines. On the other hand, there is within the theological fellowship a long-standing discussion what the aim of theological education could be. And we have approaches which have been promoted in the recent past, which are either to focus on the opportunity for the students to develop a reflective identity as a theologian in a given tradition, be it Lutheran, Reformed, or Catholic, or to focus on the competences which should be acquired by studying theology to become a teacher or a minister in the church. Let me explain this a little bit more in detail with some quotes from some of the foundational papers that common commissions of theologians of the churches and professors of theology as theologians at the universities have agreed upon. Here I have tried to translate one very complicated long German sentence into English. I hope I have done well. It says, theology is the academic approach that is a logically argumentative and methodologically convincing one to achieve an adequate understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Being an academic discipline, theology is in dialogue with other academic disciplines and sciences and is therefore studied and taught at universities since right from the beginning of the foundation of universities. There is, first of all, in the end of this quote, a reference to an honorable history of theology, which as part of the European model of universities which have grown out of theological faculties. And I understand that as a reminder that since there is such a long history, we still have a right to be in this place, the university, because theology, church, has been one of the, so to speak, forces which have brought the university into the world. Then second, I find interesting that the wording of adequate understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ is ambiguous. Adequate to what? I think that the quote here does not exclude that the adequate understanding of the gospel would, from a theological point of view, be the salvific meaning of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection for human beings. But from the context of the passage and the paper, adequate seems to refer more to logical, argumentative, and methodological academic approach, which is the legitimation for theology to remain at state universities and to be studied and taught there. In another paper which is defining the study of the aim of study of theology, the aim is defined as such: beyond this ability to represent the truth of the gospel as a person, now we are speaking from a church context, The candidate or minister must also be able to represent it publicly in the context of the institutions of the ministry, their tasks and function. And this means always twofold. They speak only about man. He must be able to express the truth of the gospel in preaching, teaching, and pastoral situations in a proper way. But he must also be able to use the content of the church's teaching, the understanding of the reality of the Christian faith, as the authoritative discovery and justification context for all measures and decisions of his office, his task being a minister. I do not know whether you agree with me and would read that awkward translation in the same way as I do the German text, but I find it remarkable that this last passage combines the aim of theological studies, that is, to develop an identity of a theologian, with the competence to proclaim it publicly in preaching, teaching, and pastoral situations in a proper way. If you remember how I characterized the secular condition of the German society, the last point can be understood as the developing of the competence to translate from the theological into the secular context and to make the message of the gospel meaningful to secular contemporaries. In a paper defining the aim of intercultural and religious studies as a special discipline within the canon of theological studies, we read, in the examination in religious studies and intercultural theology, students demonstrate that they have the methodological and theoretical knowledge and methodological skills to present a non-Christian religion and to develop interreligious and intercultural issues, and that they are able to listen open-minded to other religious witnesses and to lend the Christian faith a theological voice within the framework of interreligious and intercultural problem horizons. Excuse me. This competence that obviously is tried to measure in the final examination of such a student is referring naturally to the multicultural and multi-religious context of the secular society in Germany, that how I characterized it earlier. And it indicates to me that a kind of apologetics and the art of articulating a dialogical understanding of faith and witnessing to the own faith in the midst of other religious expressions are the competences which a theologian in the German society of today needs to, in order to preach, teach, and to cope with pastoral situations in a proper way. In this definition, I recognize the aim and the necessary competences for a theologian and ministers. In this definition of the aim and the necessary competences for a theologian and minister, I can detect the notes of the church. The definition speaks about martyria, liturgia, and diaconia, and naturally we could add kerygma. And these are exactly the notes of the church, which according to some documents of the WCC would also define a holistic understanding of mission. They would make clear that mission is the basis on which the church is formed and founded, and not the other way around, that that the church has a mission, which also to some special ministries would be true. And passages from various papers of the WCC.
Hello, Michael,
Yeah.
would you like to take a break and drink water, perhaps?
Yeah, I would. Thanks for, but I have not been well prepared, so I need to take a small break and then, yeah.
Yeah. You can go get your water.
It's okay. If I'm getting worse, then you can help me a little bit with that. I was saying that passages from various papers on the objectives of theological studies and of religious and intercultural competences formulate a holistic understanding of mission without naming it. So this is very important for me. If you look at that definition from a WCC paper, then you see that mission carries a holistic understanding. It's the proclamation and the sharing of the good news of the gospel by the word, kerygma, deed, diakonia, prayer and worship, liturgia, and the everyday witness of the Christian life, martyria. Teaching as building up and strengthening people in their relationship with God and each another, and healing as wholeness and reconciliation into koinonia, communion with God, communion with people, and communion with creation as a whole. Now, this is one of the most important points that I would like to offer you in my reflection on missional formation in a secular context. I find that if you look at the aims, objectives, and the competences that these definitions of theology and the aims of theological education are offering, I see that it is basically talking about the church as mission. Church being founded in the mission, because the ultimate aim of those people who are trained in this theological education is to teach, to preach, to be responsible in pastoral situations, and, as I would add, to be able to translate and make meaningful the Christian gospel in a context of a secular society where we find a multiplicity and diversity of religious expressions. So I think basically to reach out and to explain and to translate the own message and make it meaningful and related to other faith expressions is actually the task of somebody who has been trained in our theological education. So in a certain sense, the aim of that theological education is mission, missional formation. But the funny thing about it is that it is not named mission. It's called theology, it's called academic studies, and it's called that you become a minister, but it is not called mission. And I understand that tacitly formulated understanding of mission, which is inherent in this definition, as an attempt exactly to make theology meaningful to the secular context, as I characterized it in the opening paragraphs of my paper. This secular context is, as I have noted, not the opposite of faith, but it is one in where many different people have different opinions and attitudes and religious households from which they say how close or far away they find themselves to churches. So what I want to highlight here is that this task, this aim, this competence as a theologian is set to need to develop in my context through education and formation is actually to be communicative in this context and to explain the gospel, to make it meaningful, to relate it to the households of faith of others. And it is less about teaching people what to believe, but engaging learn in education to engage with what people believe and to make that form that into a meaningful dialogue. So I would say that the secular, as I have characterized it in the beginning of my paper, needs to be taken as the hermeneutical reference frame for doing theology and also for doing mission. The addressed people are not so much, as Schleiermacher said, cultural despisers of religion, but they may people like that one I have taken as an example from the cartoonist, who is saying that he has outgrown the Christian faith and has left it behind, but who may still have a rather positive or neutral image of church and of faith. And one reason why this approach, as I have been trying to explain, which is in a way missional, is not called mission, is that in our secular context, mission is almost exclusively identified with sending missionaries into the non-Christian world, and therefore is very strongly associated with the history of colonialism. And I find it always funny that people who live in a post-colonial society whose richness and wealth is based on a former history of exploiting colonies always think that it was only the missionaries who were colonialists. So they argue, if we get free of mission, somehow we are free of the consequences and effects of that history of colonialism. And that is an attitude which we find in many people, even those who still believe in God and within the church itself, by saying that what happened in this colonial setting, we only get rid of that if we stop doing mission. And that is identified with sending out people. So I do not know whether you want to follow me with that, but what I find characteristic about my context is this identification of mission with a certain activity in a certain period, and the consequence to finish, to get critically at odds with the history of colonialism is stopping this kind of mission. And then on the other hand, that our theological education and our theology is informed by what Bosch would call the dimensional dimension of mission, church being mission, but not calling it mission, because then they feel they get into this trouble to be confronted at once with the history of colonialism, instead of being able to relate to the actual context, the present times in our society. So quite a number of people promote the idea that the only way to cope with the past of mission in the 19th century and in the colonial framework is to just stop talk about mission. And this has an impact on the study of theology. If we follow that line, it would mean that theology is actually reduced to the internal reflection of an in-group about itself, without any importance or meaning to those outside these groups. But mission just is exactly keeping this dimension open, that what we believe has a meaning and importance for the people around us, whether they believe or not, whether they belong to the church, whether they belong to a different religion, or whether they are convinced that God doesn't exist and profess atheism. So I think that in my context, this tacit understanding of mission as foundational dimension of theology is actually a problem for missional formation, because we are, so to say, not name mission in the theological education. It is difficult to implement some missional formation in that theology unless it is about that missional dimension which is connected to the let's say, the task of a normal minister in the sense of preaching, teaching, and doing the sacraments in a proper way in the context of the church. But as I mentioned, theological studies are at the university also with the rationale that the theological professors should reach out to the secular disciplines around them, because there's a lot that is connecting to them. And I think people like you in OCMS, I do not tell anything new about that. I'm just highlighting it also as a truth in my context. So theological studies and formation miss, to my understanding, important aspects if they do not address mission, and what is more, if they do not explain which understanding of mission they are following. And there are some attempts in that in the churches, but there is a lot of criticism against mission as a period in our history, which we should finish and should be done with. And this is, for instance, to make it more practical, a problem for an organization like the one I'm working for. I'm working for an ecumenical organization of mission organizations and churches. And most theologians coming out of the standard education at the university will not bring the knowledge which is needed to do the work that we are doing. In the standard theological education at our universities, there's very little about church history outside Europe, even sometimes about outside Germany. There is not much about world Christianity. There's also not much reflection in the main theological disciplines on what mission could be beyond the rather narrow understanding of being a tag for a period in the life of the church, which is considered best to be over, as I explained. So the successful student of theology who might pass that examen about which I have been talking earlier, may have some knowledge about other religions in general, like Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, but he or she may not have heard much, let's say, about the strong Pentecostal and evangelical movements, about African instituted churches, or current mission-induced churches in Asia, something about mission organizations which are having crusades in other regions of the world. So the diversity of Christian faith dialects around the globe is not a concern, a real concern, in our standard theological education. That is a very general observation, and naturally you always find exceptions and pockets, and there are some people who are really strong in that, but I would claim that even their service, their studies, is not really touching the core curriculum of the theological education at our university. And therefore, somebody who has gone through this education has not much knowledge how churches can enhance in their own ranks an ecumenical and mission mindset, or to include, for instance, development issues, like linking the activities of churches and mission bodies to the sustainable development goals, which are very important today. This can be included under the understanding of theology as mission in word and deed. It is understood that theological studies cannot include everything. I mean, I'm very well aware that there's often a certain amount of time and of hours and of possible readings and seminars that students of theology can attend and follow, and therefore be formed by these studies. And naturally, it means that we need also to look to other spaces for learning theology than the studies in a university. But I do not know whether you would like to follow me in that. At least in my context, I observe that disciplines like church history or the exegetical disciplines would also claim that in order to make a meaningful contribution in their disciplines later as a researcher, you need to learn a lot more than what you have been acquiring in your basic studies at university. However, in exegetical studies or church histories, students would acquire basic knowledge and basic methodological skills about their discipline. And this is less the case when it comes to mission and missionary reflection. In that sense, I would say that missional formation is not a deliberate dimension of our standard theological curriculum. It's somehow tacit involved in the understanding of the aims, objectives, and competences that students should acquire by running through theological education. And this is, to my mind, surprising when I see that a basic modus of theology is actually, as explained via my quotes, to make faith and theological reflection meaningful in a secular context, where people assume that theology is a matter of an in-group to which they do not belong to, and mission is a past period we better should leave behind. So missional formation, that would be something what I would say, needs to be reflected upon consciously in the wider framework of a global Christianity, not only about this in the context of the churches in Germany, and in a context of diversity and multiplicity of other faith expressions and secular convictions in my society. And this is a task, and that is one of my points for all theological disciplines, and cannot be cannot be left alone or explained as an appendix to the curriculum, which could be called mission and intercultural studies, where students would have 1 or 2 seminars in addition what they learn in the core curriculum, which is much more interdisciplinary and interconnected among the different disciplines. If we look at how church history builds up on the history of the early church, as we read it in the New Testament, if we think about how systematic theology is considering the teaching of the Bible, if we consider how pastoral learning is also reflecting on systematic approaches, on preaching, on hermeneutical approaches to preaching, then we see how these 5 disciplines are interconnected And somehow the mission studies and interreligious studies are a little bit at the side of it. And I would say critically that there need to be more interaction between that discipline and the other disciplines which form the core of the curriculum of theology. So what to do then as a mission and ecumenical organization? I would say that recently we observe quite currently two movements in the Protestant mainline churches in Germany. There are new major documents which again emphasize that ecumenism and mission are indispensable dimensions of being church. At the same time, the support for especially bodies offering education in these fields has been cut because of dwindling funds. So there always is naturally debate about if funds are cut, who is going to get less. But it is an observation among us in the ecumenical and mission circles that we find that it is in an maybe is more hitting at these fields than other fields. And in this special situation, this conflict between different aims and tendencies, EMW had been mandated to bring together educators in theologies who are involved in what we call intercultural theology and mission studies, representative of mission bodies, which are doing also educational work and work of bringing people together and offering intercultural encounters to them, and representative of ecumenical curricula outside the universities. And the professors and educators at that round table that you organized could agree that intercultural theology and mission studies are more or less firmly implemented at the universities as a discipline. The hot debated question was how much influence this discipline has on the other theological disciplines. I say often it is more a perspective on many of the matters that come with a broader perspective of a non-Western, majority world-oriented perspective on Christianity and on mission and the situation of world religion, which in general adds, but it is not allowed to influence the core curriculum, as I have tried to explain. So I would come to a close to my preliminary reflection on what missional formation in a secularized context could be about. And I would say, first of all, just to make my point again, that I find it intriguing that somehow the dimension of mission is defined as an aim, an objective of studying theology and of being a theologian. It is defining the competences that theologians are said they need to develop in the context of our situation, but it is not called missional formation. And that, as I said, creates a problem for missional formation because somehow we are not able to call it like that, to address it like that, but we still need to do it. Then second, I would say for missional formation in Germany, we need to think not only about the studies, but also about other places where people can study theology, can encounter people of different traditional or confessional backgrounds, people of different faith backgrounds, and so on, and to interconnect that. And that comes to the image that maybe missional formation needs to be more an emphasis in the studies to allow mission studies and religious and intercultural studies to influence the core curriculum of theology. And that would be a mission for professors of this discipline. But on the other hand, that you also need to enlarge the understanding of learning theology to go to places beyond the studies at the university. And that could be, for instance, the offers for education and formation that mission bodies are giving, volunteering programs to have the chance to go abroad and to experience firsthand how Christians in other contexts are living their faith and are doing mission. And it also means that somehow we need to reach out to pastors, ministers, evangelists, catechists, people who give religious education in the church right now, to offer them some formation in missional formation. And by that also explain that mission is not colonialism, and that with a certain practice of mission in a certain period, not everything is said about mission. And there I feel a strong importance for mission bodies like the one I'm working for, because with our partners in the majority world, we can bring in these different realities and make people aware that the Christian faith is much larger, much diverser, much more dynamic and much more illuminated by the Holy Spirit if we look at it in a world, how to say, scale, if I can say so, and if we take into account the experiences and also the theology that people outside European are doing. And there I feel that this is something that we should do very strongly, and thereby also bring in other insights from outside Germany into that discussion. And I hope that it would, in a way, influence the way that we are dealing with the special secular setting in our country that I've tried to explain. Thanks a lot for your patience and for listening. And I hope that even with my English, it was understandable and could give some food to thought and for discussion. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, for bringing and sharing with us your context, which you term as a secular context, where you cannot really talk about mission or missional formation because of your country's colonial history. And yet at the same time, you've also explained well how important and significant it is for building up the competency of the theologians who would need to translate theology and the salvific faith, which is in Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, to be translated into a secularized world, which you have explained as a place where there are now understanding of God and faith and Christ in diverse way in a space which you termed as a heretical imperative within the heretical imperative, where there is now what you have said as individual and household of faith and religion, and not just a place of worship which brings people together. And you also talked about how in your context believing and belonging does not really go well, because people may be believing but they may not feel that they belong to a particular church or a particular tradition, and so there is diversity of faith and belief and understanding. And then you also problematize it by saying that how can you find something true in such a diversity? So with that, I would open the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Marina. This summing up of my thesis it gives me the feeling that I have been able to communicate what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So any comments from the floor or questions? Yeah, so while the others are formulating their comments and questions, perhaps I would just ask about how do you also talked about, that in your university context, in the Faculty of Theology, you do not really take care or consider world Christianity and about the Christianities and the diversity of faith that exists in the majority world, in the global south, especially like that of Pentecostal and the charismatic faith, which are flourishing, but that is not really accounted in your curriculum. So what do you think can the church or organizations such as yours take or do in order to create awareness or bring that element into your society or into your, what would I call, household of believers, or what you have termed as household of faith or believers in the diversity of contexts?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important question. And it's on the one hand easy to answer, and on the other hand not. It's easy in the sense of what we can do is we can bring together people from different contexts doing theology and encouraging them doing theology together, because that would create this space where theological approaches, confessional convictions, traditions, and different expression of faith could interact, and people could see, oh, there is something about faith that I'm not aware, have not been aware of. And I think we often say in our discussions that this kind of encounter can help us to learn something about our faith, which we have not been able to see before because of our contextual, let's say, prison house that we are in. On the other hand, it is in a way difficult to do because naturally all these people that I have been criticizing a little bit do a lot of important work. It's not that they are not doing theological studies that are relevant for their discipline and in their field and in, let's say, the context of a Middle European position, okay? So therefore, they would say, yeah, that's also very important, but unfortunately, I'm very busy with what I'm doing, and that is important. And I think there is the question, what maybe not so much the theological faculties, but whether we could, in a way, influence via the ministry of the churches, what we would need as competences for people who work in such a context where, I mean, let me put it that way, 30 years ago, Pentecostalism was something African, Asian for many in Germany. But since then, we have been made aware that they are there since 100 years, at least. So how to engage with the presence of these expressions of faith and also on the level of congregation believers and neighbors in fellowship and churches. And I think that is something that we could encourage the churches to take more care of. And then maybe that has an effect also on the request, what you need to learn in theology to be able to be educated to act in such a context adequately and, as I quoted, in a proper way.
Yeah, thank you. And also for those who are joining us and participating via Zoom, if you have any questions or comments to make, please raise your hand by clicking on the, I think the respond. Yeah. So I see Esther. Yeah, Esther, please unmute and ask your question or make your comments. Yeah.
Yeah, it may
Can we
be
see
a
you,
comment.
Esther?
Oops, I don't know. Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael, for the lecture and the way you evaluate and analyze your context in relation to theology. And I was feeling like, I think our students, my own students here, are tortured in terms of trying to study world Christianity. And they do all largely the European American church history, and then they end up starting to look at the African church history. And it's because of this framework of theological education that we've inherited and are imprisoned by it. That you begin from Palestine, then you go to Europe, and then come back to whatever. So my students would know more about German church history than they would know maybe their own. It's a very sad reality, but that is what it is. So like Marina is like, what can be done to your place? But I can also ask myself, what can be done to us to come out of that prison of really being stuck a lot of the European history. And secondly, I was interested in the way you talk about theology academic. It's Marcio Dioye who has talked about theology as not something that you receive, but something that you struggle with. And I'm wondering whether that kind of definition resonates with your own context. Is what are you struggling with, other than just what are you studying in terms of academics, in terms of inherited academic theology, thus making mission a particular thing that happened and is for example, identified with colonialism. While where I am, mission is the living thing. Yes, there is a context of missionaries and colonialism, but mission is an ongoing practice, something that you concluded with.
Should I answer or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Respond, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Esther, for this pertinent observations. And let me start with the last one. I think that one of the things why I made this academic context so strong is because I think we need to reflect in the secular context of my country that if you want to be at the university, you need to be an academic recognized discipline. And this you are if you follow certain standards and meet certain criteria that are set by secular academic disciplines and not so much by why you do theology. So I think one of the challenges is to keep that space at the university. I think I highly appreciate the privilege that theologians are present at state universities and that they could, connect to the secular version of their disciplines, like the church historian talk to the historians, like the systematic theologians talk to the political sciences. You get my point, right? So I think that is really, really a strong point, and it makes theology strong in Germany, but it also has given it that, how to say, that forming why people still are, studying Barth and Moltmann and the big old white man. So I think that is something we need to, on the one hand, to accept, because it is a request and how do you say, a challenge of the context in order to be allowed and to be a legitimate discipline at the university. But on the other hand, you are right. Doing theology, living theology, talking about mission, preaching, teaching, healing, and all that are things that are not done in a university context, but in the living context of people. And I think that is one of the challenges that I think the quotes I have been given are trying to identify. Can we make that as an aim of theology, that you have an identity firmly grounded in faith and that you are able from there to reach out, to connect to people and to preach and teach and do the things in proper way. So I think that's a challenge. And what I love about my work is that in a way, I see that theologians in other contexts are also struggling with that. Latest the moment when the secular ministries of education come in and say, okay, if you want your degree to be recognized, then look at these criteria, then meet that criteria, then come up with a measurement of the academic quality of your teaching, and then we will be able to recognize your degree. I think that's a conflict in world Christianity and theological education, that we have many countries where theological education is not recognized as education in the sense of delivering people, giving people a degree that is recognized and would enable them to do some, let's say, well recognized work, but only valid in the churches. I think that's not the best situation, but we realize that in other contexts, the academic impositions are very strong. So I think that's a conflict we have in different ways in different countries and contexts, and we could help each other maybe in discussing that also. In how far is theology, how we teach it, an academic discipline that is responsible to criteria that come from other disciplines and not necessarily from the motivation why we do theology in the first place. And the first point I like very much, to me, I think one of the things we could and should do together is in a way to reflect on that, what they now label as decolonized theology. I think you've made that that line very clear. There was Jesus and he was Palestine, and then there was the Greek, and then there were the Germans, and then there were the Africans. So we still do as if faith traveled from Palestine via Germany to Kenya. And I think that the IMC process in which you have been involved with your colleagues, you have studied actually these movements on the ground, which were not so much mission induced, but Holy Spirit induced. And I think that is something that we need to make strong in our teaching, that there is much more than that what happened through the missionary movement in the 19th century as we usually studied it. That would be one way of helping us out of decolonizing, and maybe your students and students at my university would have a good discussion about what does it mean to decolonize our understanding of theology and how mission and churches have come into life.
Thank you. We have Jim now.
Thank you, Dr. Biehl. My name is Jim Phillips, and I'm an American student here at OCMS. And I look forward to the presentation because my wife, who's with me here, and I have a very personal interest in the gospel being spread in Germany.
Okay.
We have a son, he's about 37. And while serving in the United States Navy, he was divinely equipped with fluency in German.
Wow.
And then as he was
That is a big gift.
he received a divine call to a very specific place called the Free Theological Seminary in Gießen.
Ah, okay.
And now I understand what the free part of that title means from your talk.
Right.
And my question is, you clearly are familiar with Gießen.
Yeah.
And by the way, the thing that we have found so encouraging, I think there's about 120 students or so there, and all of them have felt a call to bring the gospel back to the German people. It's almost a unanimous type of a calling. And I'm wondering, is this a university that you would see as teaching and presenting missiology the way you've prescribed it needs to be done for the church in Germany?
Thank you. That's an exciting question because what I could not explain is that actually as one of the person who is organizing this roundtable of intercultural theology in Germany, I have made really a strong emphasis and including that what we call the seminaries of the Baptist tradition, the Methodist tradition, the Mennonites, the Bad Liebenzeller faith mission. Gießen we did not include, and I could say a few words about that. On the one hand, I'm a strong, defender of the diversity of mission. So I would always claim that Gießen and then Elstal of the Baptists and maybe the State University of Hamburg have different understandings of what does it mean to reach out to Germans, but they are doing mission. And it is good to engage together and to exchange about it, and also in a way sometimes to, to discuss critically. And I think one of the things that I'm not so fond about Gießen and that kind of direction is that I am, as I said, convinced that the secular, as I understand it, is not the opposite of faith. And I think Gießen, in a tendency, some of what I've seen there is kind of saying that, so that mission is about attacking or fighting back secularity. And I would argue that the secular is a framework in which we believe and belong in a different way. And we should somehow find ways of engaging with that. And therefore, my point, that is what I wanted to make very clear, is very much about how do we reach out to people who are convinced that they know what they believe, but feel that exactly for that reason, they need to take distance to the church. And in my context, Gießen and similar movements are, invigorating this impression of, oh, that is something that we are beyond. That's a past gestalt of faith. I'm not agreeing with that, but I think it's an impression that the sometimes very evangelical-minded people create with the people that I'm talking about. And so I think the art is in a way to interrelate between these different expressions and not judging and saying this is not good, that is good, but to engage in a way what could be the common witness to our people and to make faith for them attractive and somehow reach out to them in such a way that they would see, oh, this is something for me. Does it help?
Yeah, thank you. Kunle.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your presentation. Louder. No, it's okay like that. Now.
Oh, now I see you.
You spoke vehemently on academic theology and missional formation. And you also made us to realize in your own context that there are household of faith or household of beliefs that people are defining by themselves. And also you mentioned that there is a difference between what we believe and also what the people believe. And when you look at academic theology, you discover that we also have official theology of the church or the congregation.
Yeah.
And local theology in a sense. And when you look at your own context, is it what the people believe that drives or inform the curriculum of the academic theology through which the missional formation is disseminated to the people? How do we balance and how do we reconnect in these conflicts and tension between academic, official, and different diversified theology mentioned in your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Kunle. Michael, you may respond, and after that, we'll have Tim with a question.
I think you ask a very, if that is a good English word, pertinent question, and I would love to sit there over with you and discuss it more in detail. So, because I think there are several dimensions in it. I think from my context, I would say that it is exactly the question, how do we do this and how do we interact? And I think one of the things that I have been 11 years in the ministry. So what I realized is not working is telling people what they should believe. Because, and as I said, this attitude of, I know what Christianity is about and I'm beyond it, is a special challenge of what I call the secular framework of our situation. So you engage with people who are convinced. I don't know, I had a long discussion with somebody who was convinced that Jesus did not die on the cross, but he was, just awakened from some drugs, and then he walked to India and there he died, and you can go and visit his grave. So that is the kind of households that sometimes you meet. And I think then you need to engage with these people in a sense of basically on the level of knowledge and saying, okay, guy, sorry, this is absolutely nonsense. We can prove that that is not true. Even if you don't believe that he died on the cross and went to heaven, has been resurrected, we can prove that he definitely has not died in India, okay? So we can get into this academic discussion. But the more interesting question as a missional question is, what does it give to you to believe that? And what would it give to you if you look at your life in the light of a different message that is about resurrection and so the salvific meaning of Christ's life, death, and resurrection? And I think these are two different things, and therefore I'm very much for academic studies because I think they help us to understand a lot. But we need somehow at a certain point to engage with the faith dimension of it. What does it mean for your life? What does it mean to you that you have that household of faith? And what would it mean if you would be willing to change it and come a little bit closer to that, what the church is standing for? But then again, and then I'm done with my attempt to answer your question quickly, we always should be aware that what we call the church has not a capital C, but it has a small c. It's my Lutheran tradition. It's my Lutheran Western Middle European tradition that is saying this is what we should believe in. And already with my Baptist friends here around, I have some discussions about the issue, about where we agree that we disagree. So it depends also on that aspect of ecumenism and a common witness to Christ, in which way we are engaging with a household of faith that the person may have constructed.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much indeed for the lecture. I think if I got this right, at the beginning you talked about how the academic theology needs to relate to the academic disciplines outside theology. Now, I'm thinking about the reactions of the people outside the scientists, the economists and so forth. Now, there will be Christians amongst them who presumably be quite warm towards interacting with Christians. But we had a student looking at a very practical thing of gold mining, and his supervisor was not a Christian. And when the guy got to the transfer panel where he's trying to show that he's worthy of transferring to the PhD stream,
Okay.
presented his information to the supervisors, and the supervisor was furious because he said, "Where's the God bit? Where's the God bit? You've left that out." And he, as a non-Christian, really only wanted to supervise this because he wanted to know what God had to say about things like gold mining in East Africa. So is that at all current in academia where you are, that there'll be non-Christian academics who'd actually be interested in what Christians have to say?
Well, that's a real fascinating story, and I would like to learn more what this guy find out about doing mining and and what God has to say about that. Very intriguing question. I've never thought about that. Yeah, I think so. See, I mean, one of the points is that we have in our academic studies already exactly that discussion. There is this discipline which we usually call mission studies, intercultural theology, and religious studies. And there are colleagues who believe that you need to do the study of religion only on the basis of cultural studies. So to speak, secular study of the philology, of the history, of the sociological composition of the communities and so on, their ethical attempts, their understanding of the world. And that is religious studies. And naturally, they would also look on Christians as an object to study exactly with the same methods. Whereas theologians would look also into the faith expressions that are inherent part of that understanding and that living the different religious faith or community. And I think there we have already this debate. And what I see, for instance, in my context is that there is a very strong interest by historians to study the encounter on the basis of the mission archives between the early missionaries and so-called indigenous or, Christians in other contexts, or those who became Christians. So there is an interest in an exchange on that, on the basis of what could we say as historians about that, beyond the fact whether it's a faith story or not. And I see the same if we study, for instance, religions, the presence of religions in Germany, like Muslim, Buddhists, and the many Hindu groups that are around here. Is that something that we engage as religious students of religion, or is it something that we also approach in a faith context? And that dialogue is ongoing. And you even could do it, if you look into systematic theology. I mean, Hegel somehow was a Christian. So you can study him as a philosopher in a totally secular way, but you also could look into him in how far his faith, his understanding of God has influenced his philosophy, and the other way around, in how far his understanding of phenomenology has informed students of theology. So I think there are a lot of things, but it's an important aspect of doing theology in that context, to exactly look this, how to say, docking points. Can you say that in English? Between secular studies, secular interests on religion's expression, and the other way around, whether you also look at it from an inside perspective. I don't know whether that addressed your question.
There is a book on the PhD came out as a book, so you can buy the book from Regnum.
Okay, good. Thank you. I will get a copy when I next visit you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, there's one more question here.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate the way you presented about theological education and missional formation in a way that interaction should be considered in a secular context. My question is related with the worries that the church has these days. So far, we have been discussing about going out to universities and all, secularized settings, in a sense to share maybe the truth of the gospel in a way that is convincing to them, maybe following the model set by Schleiermacher and all those people who laid the foundation to take theological education in the curriculum of universities. And you are raising this important idea of missional formation, maybe more similar to what Robert Banks has proposed about transforming, the society. My question is, the church is being secularized at the moment, as we see from different writings and witnesses. So how does this idea of integration or interaction consider the problem within the church? Instead of thinking of the outside, both are, I think, when it comes to missions, both are like the two sides of one coin. So the church is losing its ground. As we see from history, once the church was the owner of even universities, even theological education was existing before even the existence of universities. So this strong heritage has been really attacked by secularization. So what would you say in light of that, about missional formation?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that really intriguing question. And I think we would need to have a whole seminar on that in order to find out what we need to look into it, but for me, it is on two levels, a very brief answer, okay? First of all, I think that it is in a way also, why do we have this perspective of loss? Where does this come from? I mean, see, in Germany, we see people are leaving the church in numbers, high numbers, okay? But numerically, still 22 million are Protestants here. I mean, that's not nothing. So where does this come from, this feeling from we are losing? Maybe it is also in a way a consolidation and makes the church stronger in the way it can reach out and also relate to people who have been nominally a member of the church but never could really relate to it. In my time in ministry, I met a lot of people who said they are members of the church because the church is doing good for others. But they never expected anything from that church for themselves. And I think that may be in a clearer way if they are not a member, but if they are then engaging with what the church stands for and what we can offer to them. So I think on that level, I would question a little bit always this perspective of loss. We have lost the universities. Yeah, why? Because we also have hopefully freely giving up the power that has been involved in that way of things and being able to manipulate and to monopolize and also to destroy people like, the way the church dealt with the heretics. And maybe that is my conviction. We could only get rid of that period and that attitude to power in order to control people if, as a church, we have also been able to give free other things. So I would look into that history not always as a history of a loss, but also as a history of gaining freedom and of gaining liberty in God to do something in that world that he created. You may not agree with me, but I think that's one point we should talk about in the sense of what's the perspective on the history. And the other thing is that, yeah, if we talk about the inner situation of the church, I think that's really an intriguing discussion. How is it in your church? How is it in my church? And I would say in my church, are somehow always liked these people who had this kind of semi-critical attitude to their membership of the church, who were not, you know, they were not only easily listening to my preaching, but they would say, hey, but Pastor, why? Why this? How do you think that? Why do you imagine this to happen? Or why do you tell me that this is faith when I think it is differently? And I think that discussion about faith is the value of it. So, and I think that is what I value very much in the situation I'm living in, that there are at least people who ask and who discuss instead of just following what I tell them, because I'm the pastor and they the sheep, so to say. I make it a bit elementary, okay, and maybe a bit as a caricature, but I want to be very clear in that what I try to say to these points.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, with your comments. Yeah, I really like what you said about, I mean, like what I got from you, what your response was, that it's also good that we got rid of our glorious past.
Yes.
To become more vulnerable, to meet
Yes.
others and to relate with others in vulnerability and in humility, and to take that as an opportunity and always not look at it as a loss.
Right.
So I think
Thank you.
that is what I take from that it's not only with power, but it's also with vulnerability that we can reach out to others and also experience the work of the Holy Spirit. And
I think that's especially important for people like me, old white men, right? So we have a special lesson to learn in that.
Yes, one more.
Thank you, Mike, for the lecture. My question, and might be even comments. There is one of the largest missionary movement within Islam called Tabligh Jamaat. Currently, they are growing, the fastest growing. So do you think that as Christian mission, is there anything to learn from the Tabligh Jamaat? The reason I'm asking that, the Tabligh Jamaat learned a lot from the early days of missionaries, particularly in India.
Mm-hmm.
These days, I think there are some areas which we need to learn from them as even one of the best practices of missionary movements. What would be your comment on that, learning from our neighbors? Thank you.
I would say, first of all, I would like to learn more about that movement. I'm not aware of that, so I cannot comment on it. Okay, but I think that I would always say that if I look into the history of how mission has been done from this country to somewhere else, we have always chosen certain forms, and they were very organized. And I see in world Christianity in various places, in India definitely, but also in China or in some countries of the African continent, that there are much different forms of mission, of making the gospel meaningful to the people. And I think that we need this diversity of expressions, because mission is not only in one form and only if we do it according to the book, you know, but we need to realize that mission is also happening on a very informal way in the daily life. So I like very much these approaches of speaking about dialogue and about mission as a form of co-living. And I think there is a lot to learn because it involves all members of the congregation and of the church, and not only the professional missionary. And I think that is one of the points that we should learn from the past. What is my way of doing mission, even though I'm not ordained, even though I'm not sent out as a missionary, but my workplace, the place where I engage with people, my neighborhood where, you know, I meet all kinds, people of all ways of life, that is the place where my witness is asked. And therefore, I would agree with you, let's study what others discover as possible forms of doing mission or being in mission, maybe the better expression, and not tell them, oh, that's not what you should do. And I think that can be a very positive response to some of the forms that, at least here in my country, we are used to call mission. Mission is only if somebody is sent somewhere else, okay? And I would say, no, mission is happening wherever you live your life, and it's transparent for your motivation and your faith to the people around you. And sometimes the Holy Spirit helps you to engage with them. Sometimes they just observe what you do, and sometimes they get angry on you and somehow start to question you. So I think there are many possibilities of being in mission.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your lecture and where you share with us the context in which missional formation and theological education is understood, and also the implications and significance of it in your secularized context. Thank you very much. And with that, we will end today's session. And next week, we have Carla Cole, who will be presenting to us Weaving a Community of Learning and Care, UBL Online During the Pandemic. Dr. Carla Cole is the director of the School of Theological Sciences of the Latin American Biblical University in Costa Rica. So I hope you all will attend and participate in the discussion next week. Yeah, so with that, we will end. Thank you.
Thank you for listening and for the discussion, and I'm looking forward to next week, which I hope to be able to attend. Thank you. Bye.